Welcome to The Forge. Thank you for joining the podcast today. Today's another lesson day about Who is God Part 3. I want to get this out there for everybody to give a little bit of history about what God has done for us and who God truly is. It's not a real in-depth study, but it's a good overall informative study. So I pray that it's a blessing and encourages you today. God bless you. So I want to jump into this lesson plan today, and like I said, this is a word for word lesson plan, but I pray that it helps you. So we're talking about bringing men to Jesus and finding out who God is. And from the lesson point, I want to take this opportunity to talk to you about the from Abraham to the law of Moses. And the lesson point is to explain the purpose in selecting Abraham and making him the father of a nation from which the Messiah would eventually be born, would eventually come from. It's to trace the descendants of Abraham and learn how Israel became that nation. To travel with the children of Israel from Egypt to Mount Sinai and where they were taught the law of Moses. To discuss the Ten Commandments, to learn the parallel between the tabernacle and the wilderness and the death. Excuse me, just a little bit. And the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. You see, in the first part, it goes into the call of Abraham. So in chart 1, we're talking about the call of Abraham. Let's see. Oh, I'm sorry. Forgive me. Totally forgive me. I forgot to flip it over. I do apologize for that. My bad. Sorry. Trying to get this camera set up, I got really distracted. So in chart 1 talks about the call of Abraham. The great flood was survived by only 8 people. It wasn't just Noah. Noah had a family, of course, and God cared about Noah's family the way he cared about Noah, because Noah cared about his family. So Noah and his wife, there was Ham, there was Shem, and there was Japheth, and their wives. And the Lord sent them from the ark and commanded them to replenish the earth. That's the second time in the scripture that God sends people to replenish the earth. First time was Adam and Eve, and this time he's talking about Noah and his wife and his sons and their daughters to replenish the earth. So less than 200 years after the flood, there were multitudes of people all living in the general area, which is now what we look at on a map and call it Iraq. Human nature typically remains the same. There was a great wickedness in the beginning, even to develop in the earth. Even when he started to restart the earth, even when things were going to be replenished, there was still wickedness there. So the Shemites were the blessed tribe, the designed messianic line. So Jesus Christ would eventually come out of the line of Shem, one of Noah's sons. Eventually Christ would be born as a direct descendant, if you want to put it that way. For the most part, the Shemites would inhabit what we would call Palestine now. And there was a faction that migrated toward what became Asia Minor. And there also was a representation of the Shemites in the land of Ur and Chaldees, the birthplace of Abraham. And at the dispersion of Babel, the Shemites became the focal point of the Bible story. And that brings us to Abraham, which is our topic, or our next topic for this. God realizes that he could no longer deal with the world as a whole. There was a marked acceleration in sinfulness, and that it had not been before the flood. It took some time to build up to the flood, to the sin of mankind, to build up to the place of the flood. But even now, there is something coming that's even faster than it was the first time. So man had developed into philosophies from which false religions and political systems would soon begin to be evident or prevalent everywhere. So man was not just pursuing the lust of his eye and the lust of his flesh, but now they were beginning to develop something new. They were beginning to develop something that they didn't have before in the first flood. They were developing their own philosophies. their own vain deceits. A man was devising new ways of going out from the presence of God to do it his way. And God let them go. This time God didn't warn them or correct them all the time. He let them go. In fact, he scattered them upon the whole face of the earth. For the Tower of Babel was a scattering. Man had forced God's hand, and God gave them over to their religions and idolatry and their social orders. No more would there be one language or one speech. No more would God strive with them as one people. Man chose a religio-political system instead of God's plan for his life. And God's reaction was to let them have it their way. That's sad. We think that, the separation of the church and state, even here in America, is designed to keep the church out of the government. But really what it's designed is to keep the government out of the church. The church is supposed to have influence in the government, but the government's not supposed to have influence in the church. Unfortunately, we have replicated what they were doing in Babylon at the Tower of Babel. We have reconciled or put both the government and has influence over the religion now. The government is involved with all religious orders rather than the church being the one that influenced the government. So we want to talk about the call. You see, God was an innate initiate of the greatest chain of events that the world had ever known. He decided to separate one man from the rest of the world. That man would be known as the friend of God. That man would become a great nation, and he would progenerate a race of people who would eventually present the Messiah to the entire world. God searched for that man, and he found him in the land of Ur of Chaldees. Abraham, at the time it was Abram, was what he found. That was the man that he said that could be my friend. In Abraham, he found a man that he would use to start a new race of people that would honor the true concept of who he is, and he would initiate a plan that would eventually culminate in the redemption of all mankind. We need to be able to consider the facts that if there had been no Abraham, there would be no Jews. If there had been no Jews, then no Jesus. If there were no Jesus, there would be no Redeemer of the entire world. The Messiah could have only descended from a chosen, set-apart people. Out of the religious bloodline of Seth, Abraham was the patriarch of the Jewish people, a people called and chosen and set apart for their time. It is here that Abraham, that God's plan of redemption commences, and it is the pivotal point upon which the whole story of redemption is hinged. 14 chapters of the book of Genesis is devoted to this one man named Abraham. We have more scripture and text on the events of his life than we do all the generations before the flood. This should help us understand the importance of how great this man's life was. Genesis 12, verses 1 through 3 say, Now the Lord said unto Abram, Get thee out of thy country and from thy kindred and from thy father's house and unto the land that I will show thee. And I will make thee a great nation, and I will bless thee and make thy name great, and thou shalt be a blessing. And I will bless them that bless thee, and I will curse them that curse thee. In thee shall all the families of the earth be blessed. Now you got the next part of the study of just finding out who God is and how this all began, is we go talk about the promises of God. You see, Abraham's faith caught God's attention. He saw the hunger in Abraham's heart for something greater than just those idols that his brother was creating and carving. He saw something in the potential that Abraham had. Abraham hungered for something real. He wanted something alive. He did not want these idols that he could make with his own hands or have his brother carve him out a new one. When God spoke to Abraham, he called him out, and his faith was so great that he forsook everything to follow this God he had never known. Abraham spent a lifetime, 70 years, worshiping idols and sacrificing to things that he thought would bring the rain and in favor. And they never spoke back to him. They never answered him. They never gave him hope. He wanted something real. So in Genesis 12, the Lord told Abraham that if he would follow him, that word if is always a big word in any conversation. If God would give him a land. He also promised him to make of him and his descendants a great nation that is to be like the stars of heaven. He also promised a spiritual seed, singular. Through him, all the earth will be blessed. And the Lord said, I will bless them that bless thee, and I will curse them that curse thee. That seed that promise was given to Abraham, that in that promise, the whole world would receive something they could not get without Abraham. You see, Abraham's faith talks about his faith in Genesis chapter 15, verse 6, and he believed in the Lord, and he counted it for righteousness. Romans 4:20 says, he, or Abraham, staggered not at the promises of God through unbelief, but was strong in faith, giving glory to God. Hebrews 11, verses 8, 9. Excuse me. By faith, when he was called to go out into a place which he should after receive for an inheritance, obeyed, and he went out not knowing where he went. By faith he sojourned in the land of promise as a strange land, dwelling in tabernacles with Isaac and Jacob and the heirs of him of that same place. You see, Abraham's faith accompanied with obedience to the commands of God's voice. Faith is dead without works, is what the Bible says. We'll jump off track here for just a second, but faith is dead without works. You can't tell me you believe God can do anything and everything and then you never act on anything. Faith is dead without works. You've got to put it into obedience. You've got to put it into action. Don't tell me you have faith that God can build the Eiffel Tower, but then you never go start working on the Eiffel Tower. Wow, Lefty, what's going on? Just all of a sudden I've started sneezing, yawn. All these things are coming on me. It's going to get better, though. So Abraham's faith was accompanied by his obedience to God. A relationship with God that's built upon faith in God has produced something phenomenal. Genesis 17, verses 1 and 4 says, 1 through 4 says, now the Lord has said to Abram, get thee out of thy country and from thy kindred and from thy father's house into a land that I will show thee. So Abraham departed. You see, he had faith to listen. He listened to the command, and then he obeyed it. Obedience will always pressure you to do something different and make you uncomfortable. It's designed to. The verse shows the willingness that Abraham had to obey God and the resoluteness of his character. Abraham's obedience is emphasized in Genesis 18:19. He says, for I know him that he will command his children in his house after him, and they shall keep the way of the Lord to do justice and judgment, that the Lord may bring upon Abraham that which he has spoken to do. So God said, I know him. God said he will command. God says, and they shall keep my ways, the way of the Lord. God had confidence in Abraham's obedience. The one who can look upon a man's heart said that he knew Abraham and was convinced that he would keep the way of the Lord. And now let us I'm going to turn our attention a little bit over to the subject of Abraham's posterity. The culture of that day, it demanded a man had to have a son to carry on his name and to inherit the family's possessions. Abraham needed a boy. It wasn't able to be passed on to a daughter. He needed a son. So all the promises that God had given to Abraham demanded a son. everything that God had spoken to him was on the stipulation that one day he would have a boy of his own to pass this on to this promise, this command, this obedience. He was going to have pass it on to somebody. So he wanted a son in whose heart he could instill the way of the Lord. Abraham's like any other dad. He wants to pass on what he has loved, what he has found that was good, and God is it for Abraham. So everything he ends upon that point, he must have a descendant. And how could he produce an entire nation if he did not even have one son? See, a lot of people had many sons. They had big families back then to protect and to grow and to strengthen and to carry the family's name on. But Abraham didn't even have one son. So philosophies and using vain deceits, man was devising new ways. Oh, please forgive me. Flipped it over and I got ahead of us. Got behind myself. So in Abraham's mind, he had to come up with a way to fulfill this promise of God. And that's where you get Ishmael. You see, Abraham was desperate about the whole situation. He was willing to obey God. And Sarah, his wife, was no doubt frustrated with her inability to have children. So she devised a plan that forever changed the course of history. Sarah got frustrated. She loved Abraham. She wanted to give Abraham what he wanted. She wanted a son, but she was having problems and couldn't. Genesis 16, 1 and 2, and verse 15, it says, Now Sarai, Abram's wife, bare him no children, and that she had a handmaid, an Egyptian, whose name was Hagar. And Sarai said unto Abram, Behold, now the Lord hath restrained me from bearing. I pray thee, go in unto my maid, and it may be I may obtain children by her. And Abraham hearkened to the voice of Sarai, and Hagar bore Abram a son, and Abram called his name, which Hagar bare, Ishmael. Now what happened, Sarah was a midwife. Sarai was a midwife to a lot of different women. But what they did in order to help relieve, Hagar was supposed to come in and sit on the lap of Sarai as this child was born, as a sign that this was supposed to be Sarai's kid also, that she had given birth in this metaphor-looking scenario. But, of course, this wasn't God's intention. So you see, Ishmael was not the son of promise. Ishmael, the covenant that God had promised Abraham, could only be realized in an offspring whose father and mother were both descendants of the righteous bloodline of the Shemites. So we got to remember that Shem was the son that was blessed by Noah, the preserver of the Messianic line. Ishmael was the son of a bondwoman, and his mother was an Egyptian slave. Even though Abraham was Ishmael's biological father, and even though Abram loved him very much, God would not establish a covenant with Ishmael. And Abraham's wife, Sarah, who was a true descendant of Shem, would receive a miracle from which God would enable her to conceive and give birth to Isaac. And the everlasting covenant between Abraham and God would be established in Isaac, the son of a free woman. See, Sarai was Abraham's half-sister. They both came out of the same bloodline. They had different mothers, but the same father. So they both came out of the same bloodline. So the promise was to that bloodline. It wasn't to the bloodline of Japheth. Ham. The bloodline of Ham is where Hagar would have come from. So that was bondage. That bloodline was cursed. That bloodline had been cursed because he was one of the ones who uncovered Noah's nakedness, and Noah cursed his son Canaan after that. So Ishmael became the father of the entire Aram world, and he would actually be a wild man in his hand against every man, and every man's hand against him. And Ishmael would be fruitful, and he would multiply exceedingly. But the son of the bondwoman was born of the will of the flesh. And the continual warfare in the Middle East and threat of the Muslim terrorists and the struggle to gain control of Jerusalem is all a result of Ishmael being born of the will of a carnal nature or the flesh. If they had waited on the promise, they wouldn't have some of the things they have now, and we wouldn't be dealing with some things we still deal with now. You see, Isaac, when we talk about him directly, Isaac is about 14 years old when about 14 years after Ishmael would have been about 14 years old when Isaac was born, when Sarah actually gave birth. So they were that close to getting the promise. They were that close to not having to deal with all this other mess, but they wouldn't wait on God. Genesis 21:1-5 says, "And the Lord visited Sarah, and he said, and the Lord did unto Sarah as he had spoken. For Sarah conceived, and she bare Abraham a son in his old age, and at the set time which God had spoken to him. And Abraham called his son that was born unto him, whom Sarah had bare Isaac. And Abraham, circumcised his son Isaac after he was 8 days old, as God had commanded him. And Abraham was 100 years old, and his son was born unto him." You see, God performed a miracle in the womb of Sarah, just as he had promised. And Isaac was a long-awaited son of promise, and the everlasting covenant of God's chosen people was established in Isaac, because Isaac came out of the blessed bloodline of the Shemites, or Shem. Sarah and Abraham both were Shemites. Hagar was not. So the promise came through in the form of Isaac. So the son of a free woman was the rightful heir of this promise. Sarah, in her resentment of Ishmael, demanded that Abraham cast Hagar and her son out of the camp. Sarah, like any woman would be, when she finally got what she wanted, she finally got her own boy, she was bitter. She was bitter how Hagar had treated her for 14 years. She was bitter that Abraham loved Ishmael and that she didn't really give birth to Ishmael, so she had bitterness in her. So she went and done what most wives do in a scenario. In his love for his boy, Abraham went to God for direction. She wanted him gone, so Abraham said, "I'm not doing that until I talk to God." Because Abraham loved Ishmael. The Lord told him to do as Sarah had said, cast out the bondwoman and her son. The Lord promised to take care of Ishmael for Abraham's sake, but the covenant would be fulfilled in Isaac. Sarah was also mad at herself that she allowed and even suggested that Abraham go into Hagar, that he would go in and have this extramarital relationship and produce another child. She was mad at herself, but she took it out on everybody else. But thankfully, God used that scenario to separate this, the seed of the bondwoman and the seed of the free woman, and to fulfill the covenant. So Isaac takes his place as the patriarch. Because see, as long as Ishmael's the firstborn, he's the one who gets the promise. So Isaac takes his place as the patriarch in the founding of the Hebrew nation, and he is respected as a preserver and a perpetuator of the covenant of God, and had given to Abraham, and he received the birthright from Abraham and later pronounced even upon his own son Jacob. Abraham sends his faithful servants to Haran to search for a bride for Isaac among his people there, and the servant with help from the Lord, finds a beautiful Rebekah who was willing to leave everything and to become wife to Isaac. Now I'm going to stop right there because this is supposed to flip over to the next chart and things, but I'm going to stop right there and talk a little bit about Abraham before I end this video. Abraham loved God. Abraham was willing to do whatever it took, but his wife's voice got in his ear. We've got to be careful, even from people that we love, whose voice we're listening to. When she offered this suggestion to Abraham, we can do what God, we can fulfill the things of God. This must be the only way that God's seen it. He's got to be careful. He's got to be wise enough to say, I know my wife loves me, and I know this is tempting to go into Hagar. She's a beautiful woman. There's no strings attached. I know there's temptation, and my wife's approving of it. Abraham's got to have more sense than that. Abraham's got to be able to go to God and say, God, is this the plan? Is this how you're going to bring this to pass, rather than just listening to what some woman or some wife or somebody has to say in his ear? Even though he trusts Sarah, even though he loves Sarah, even though he would do everything for Sarai, he's still got to talk to God, because God's the one who sees the ending from the beginning and the beginning from the end. Sarah don't know. Sarah's in her own frustration. She's trying to figure these things out to make Abraham happy. But she brought a curse upon all of us with this type of people, this Ishmaelites. I'm not saying the people are bad people. They can be delivered and healed just like anyone else. It's becoming the same for everyone now, but it brought a lot of war, and it brought a lot of turmoil into the world, because Sarai was in the ear of Abraham, and Abraham, in all of his obedience for all these years, didn't listen. He said, I listened to you when you told me to leave my dad. I listened to you when you told me to leave my brother. I listened to you when you told me to leave my land. But I didn't listen to you. I didn't go to you when my wife got in my ear. So it's important that we remember for the future studies of these things, that we just don't listen to what everybody has to say, that we learn how to go to God himself. So I encourage you, Dave. I'm going to end this lesson. It's about halfway through. I'm going to end it short so I can break it up in 2 parts. But I encourage you, even people you love, you still need to go to the Lord about that also. Don't just believe everything you're told. And don't just take it and run with it just because it sounds good. God bless each and every one of y'all.